On the morning of July 24th, 1984, at approximately 9:15 a.m., Samuel Loring Morrison sat at his desk on the fourth floor of the Naval Intelligence Support Center in Suitland, Maryland, a sprawling complex of buildings approximately 8 miles southeast of Washington, D.C., and considered what he was about to do. Morrison was 41 years old, a civilian employee who had worked in naval intelligence for 14 years. His desk was positioned near a window that looked out over the parking lot, and on clear days he could see the Maryland suburbs stretching toward the District of Columbia skyline. That particular morning was humid and overcast, typical for the Washington area in late July, with the promise of afternoon thunderstorms. The weight of the decision before him seemed to press down with the same oppressive heaviness as the summer air. Morrison's official job title was Intelligence Research Specialist. His work involved analyzing information related to Soviet naval capabilities, ship construction, weapons systems, fleet movements, operational patterns. The work required a top-secret security clearance with additional compartmented access to signals, intelligence, and satellite imagery. In his 14 years at the Naval Intelligence Support Center, Morrison had earned a reputation as knowledgeable and competent, if somewhat eccentric. Colleagues described him as intellectually curious, opinionated about naval history, and occasionally difficult to work with. He had a tendency to lecture others about subjects he considered himself expert in, particularly anything related to naval warfare or intelligence gathering. Samuel Morrison came from what might be called an intellectual pedigree. His grandfather was Samuel Eliot Morrison, the Pulitzer Prize-winning naval historian who had written the definitive 15-volume history of U.S. naval operations in World War II and had served as Admiral Ernest King's official historian during the war. Growing up with this legacy had shaped Samuel Loring Morison's identity and aspirations in ways both inspiring and burdensome. He had attended the University of Maryland, studying history with a focus on naval affairs, hoping to follow in his grandfather's footsteps as a naval historian and writer. After graduating in 1967, Morrison had briefly worked as a journalist before joining the Navy's civilian intelligence apparatus in 1970. The job had appealed to him because it combined his interests in naval affairs, history, and current events. It also provided steady employment with government benefits and a security clearance that gave him access to information most historians could only dream of seeing. For the first several years, Morrison had found the work intellectually satisfying. He was analyzing real intelligence about Soviet naval capabilities during one of the most intense periods of the Cold War at sea. But by the early 1980s, Morrison had become increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as the limitations of his position. He was an analyst, not a decision-maker. He wrote reports that were read by other analysts and occasionally by senior officials, but he had no direct influence on policy. His salary was modest. In 1984, he earned approximately $31,000 per year, which was comfortable but not generous, particularly given the cost of living in the Washington area. He was divorced, paying child support for 2 children, and living in a small apartment in suburban Maryland. At 41, he was beginning to feel that his career had stagnated, that the promise of his grandfather's legacy had not materialized in his own professional life. Morrison had attempted to supplement his income and fulfill his intellectual ambitions by writing. He had published several articles in military journals and had done some freelance work for defense publications. In 1982, he had begun writing for Jane's Defense Weekly, a British publication that was highly regarded in defense and intelligence circles for its detailed coverage of military technology and capabilities. Jane's paid its contributors modestly, typically a few $100s per article, but the publication provided Morrison with an outlet for his knowledge and a connection to the broader defense journalism community. Before we continue with how Morrison's relationship with Janes would lead to the first Espionage Act conviction for leaking to the press, if you're interested in the real stories behind Cold War intelligence operations and the human cost of espionage, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you documented cases like this every week, examining the choices people made and the consequences that followed. Now, let's talk about how an ordinary intelligence analyst's frustration would push him across a line he could never step back from. His relationship with Janes had started innocently enough. He had submitted an article about Soviet naval exercises based on unclassified sources and his own analysis. The editors had been impressed and had asked for more contributions. Over the next 2 years, Morrison had written approximately a dozen articles for Janes, all based on information he claimed was derived from open sources or from his own expertise. The editors apparently had no reason to question this, as Morrison's government employment was known to them, and they assumed he was careful about classification issues. But in early 1984, Morrison's relationship with Janes had evolved in a direction that crossed legal and ethical boundaries. According to later testimony and court records, Morrison had begun to believe that certain classified information about Soviet military capabilities should be made public, both because it would enhance public understanding of the Soviet threat and because it would enhance his own reputation as a knowledgeable source. He rationalized that the information he was considering releasing was not truly damaging to U.S. national security, but was instead being unnecessarily classified by bureaucrats who didn't understand the value of public discourse. This rationalization conveniently aligned with his professional ambitions and his financial needs. The Reagan administration had issued Executive Order 12,356 in April 1982, which significantly expanded classification authority and reversed the trend toward declassification that had characterized the late 1970s. The order gave government agencies broader discretion to classify documents and made it more difficult to challenge classification decisions. Critics argued that the administration was using classification to shield politically sensitive information from public scrutiny. Defenders maintained that the expansion was necessary to protect intelligence sources and methods during a period of renewed Cold War tensions. Morrison saw himself as pushing back against what he viewed as excessive secrecy, though his motivations were not purely idealistic. The specific material that Morrison was contemplating taking on that July morning in 1984 consisted of classified satellite photographs. These photographs had been taken by a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite, part of the Kennan series of advanced imaging systems that the United States operated to monitor Soviet military installations and activities. The KH-11 satellites, which had been operational since December 1976, represented a significant advance in intelligence-gathering technology. Unlike earlier satellites that used film canisters that had to be recovered from orbit, the KH-11 transmitted digital images via encrypted radio signals directly to ground stations, providing near real-time intelligence with resolution estimated by defense analysts at approximately 6 inches, detailed enough to read license plates from orbit. The particular photographs that Morrison had access to showed a Soviet nuclear-powered aircraft carrier under construction at the Black Sea shipyard in Nikolaev on the coast of Ukraine. The carrier, which would eventually be named Admiral Kuznetsov, was the first of its kind being built by the Soviet Union and represented a significant expansion of Soviet naval power projection capabilities. U.S. intelligence had been monitoring the construction closely, as the carrier's completion would fundamentally change the naval balance in certain regions and signal Soviet intentions to develop a true blue water navy capable of challenging American carrier groups. These photographs were classified secret, with additional compartmented control markings indicating they were talent keyhole imagery, a designation reserved for satellite and aircraft reconnaissance products. Their classification was based on several critical factors. The photographs revealed the precise capabilities of U.S. reconnaissance satellites, including the resolution and angle at which images could be obtained. They revealed what the U.S. intelligence community knew about Soviet shipbuilding capabilities and construction timelines. They could potentially reveal to the Soviets that their shipyard was under continuous surveillance, which might prompt them to take countermeasures such as constructing camouflage or moving sensitive operations indoors or to locations not under observation, and they provided targeting information that could be used in wartime operations. The classification was not bureaucratic over caution, but a reasoned judgment about protecting intelligence sources and methods. Morrison had legitimate access to these photographs as part of his work analyzing Soviet naval capabilities. They were stored in a secure vault within the Naval Intelligence Support Center, and analysts with appropriate clearances could retrieve them for review. Security procedures required that classified materials remain within designated secure areas and that personnel sign documentation when accessing sensitive compartmented information. On July 24, 1984, Morrison removed 3 of these photographs from the vault. According to his later testimony and court documents, he carried them to his desk, placed them in his briefcase, and at the end of the workday, walked out of the building with them concealed among his personal papers. Security procedures at the Naval Intelligence Support Center in 1984 included guards at the entrance, badge access controls, and periodic security inspections. However, there were no systematic searches of personnel leaving the building, particularly of long-term employees like Morrison, whose security clearances were current and who had no history of security violations. The assumption underlying the system was that cleared personnel understood their obligations and that the combination of security clearances, access controls, classification markings, and professional culture would prevent unauthorized removal of classified material. The system relied heavily on trust, and Morrison had just violated that trust. Morrison drove home to his apartment in Crofton, Maryland, approximately 20 miles south of the Naval Intelligence Support Center. According to his later statements to investigators, he spent that evening considering what to do with the photographs. He knew that what he had done, removing classified material from a secure facility, was already a serious violation of security regulations and potentially a crime under federal law. But he had not yet taken the step that would transform the violation into espionage. That decision would come in the following days. Over the next week, Morrison prepared the photographs for transmission to Jane's Defense Weekly in London. Using equipment at his apartment, he made photographic copies of the satellite images. The copies degraded the quality somewhat, but the essential details remained visible. The hull of the aircraft carrier under construction, the shipyard facilities surrounding it, the cranes and construction equipment, the spatial layout that revealed construction methods. The degradation was not sufficient to obscure the intelligence value of the images or to conceal their origin as satellite reconnaissance products. On July 31, 1984, 1 week after he had removed the photographs from the Naval Intelligence Support Center, Morrison placed the copies in an envelope, along with a brief article analyzing the significance of the Soviet carrier program. He addressed the envelope to the editorial offices of Jane's Defense Weekly in London and deposited it in a public mailbox. With that simple action, Dropping an envelope into a mailbox, Morrison crossed the line from security violation to espionage. Under U.S. law, specifically Title 18, United States Code, Section 793 of the Espionage Act of 1917, as amended, the unauthorized transmission of classified defense information to unauthorized recipients constituted espionage regardless of the recipient's nationality, intentions, or relationship to the United States. The fact that Jane's Defense Weekly was a British publication and that the United Kingdom was a close U.S. ally was legally irrelevant. The photographs were classified national defense information. Morrison was not authorized to release them, and Janes was not authorized to receive them. Intent to harm the United States was not an element of the offense. The law required only that Morrison knew the information was classified, knew he was transmitting it to someone not authorized to receive it, and did so willfully. Morrison apparently believed, or wanted to believe, that his action would be seen as whistleblowing or as a contribution to public discourse rather than as espionage. He may have thought that because he was not transmitting the information to a hostile foreign government and because he was not receiving substantial payment, his actions would be treated leniently if discovered. He may have rationalized that the public's right to know about Soviet military capabilities outweighed the technical violation of classification rules. If he thought any of these things, he was profoundly mistaken about how the U.S. government, and particularly the intelligence community, would view his actions. The photographs arrived at Jane's Defense Weekly offices in London in early August 1984. The editors were initially thrilled. The images were of exceptional quality and showed details of Soviet shipbuilding that had never been publicly revealed. The photographs would be a significant scoop for the publication, confirming Jane's reputation as the premier source for exclusive coverage of military developments. According to later accounts from former Jane's staff members, there was discussion among the editors about whether the photographs might be classified U.S. intelligence material and whether publishing them might create legal or diplomatic problems. The images bore certain characteristics: the angle of view, the resolution, the lack of atmospheric distortion, that suggested satellite origin rather than aircraft reconnaissance or ground-level photography. However, the decision was made to publish. The reasoning, as later articulated by Jane's editorial leadership, was that the photographs had been provided by a regular contributor who had assured them the material could be published, that Jane's had not solicited classified information and therefore bore no legal responsibility for its receipt, that the information was of significant public interest regarding Soviet military capabilities, and that as a British publication, Jane's was not subject to U.S. classification restrictions. Whether this reasoning was legally sound or ethically defensible would become a matter of debate, but in August 1984, it led to a decision to proceed with publication. On August 9, 1984, Jane's Defense Weekly published the satellite photographs in an article titled "Soviet Carrier Program Advances." The article included one of the images showing the aircraft carrier under construction and provided technical analysis of what the photograph revealed about Soviet naval aviation capabilities, construction methods, and timeline to operational deployment. The publication did not identify the source of the photographs, referring to them only as exclusive imagery obtained by Jane's. The article was featured prominently, with the satellite photograph displayed on the cover of that week's issue. The publication immediately attracted attention in defense and intelligence circles in both the United States and the Soviet Union. For U.S. intelligence officials monitoring open-source publications for potential leaks of classified information, the Jane's article was immediately recognizable as a compromise of talent keyhole satellite imagery. The resolution, the angle of view, and the specific targeting of the Nikolaev shipyard all indicated that the photograph had originated from a KH-11 satellite pass. For Soviet intelligence officers who routinely reviewed Western defense publications, the Janes article provided confirmation that their shipyard was under satellite surveillance and provided specific information about U.S. reconnaissance capabilities that could inform countermeasures. The Naval Investigative Service, the law enforcement branch of the U.S. Navy responsible for investigating security violations and criminal offenses involving naval personnel and facilities, immediately opened an investigation. The investigation was assigned to Special Agent John Hartman, a 38-year-old investigator with 12 years of experience in naval security cases. Hartman had previously worked cases involving espionage, security violations, and unauthorized disclosure, and he understood both the technical aspects of classification systems and the investigative techniques necessary to identify the source of a leak. Hartman's initial challenge was determining how Jane's Defense Weekly had obtained the photographs. The images were unquestionably authentic U.S. satellite imagery, which meant they had originated from one of the intelligence agencies that had access to KH-11 satellite data, primarily the National Reconnaissance Office, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, or military intelligence branches like Naval Intelligence. The number of people with access to these specific images was limited but not insignificant. A review of intelligence community distribution records indicated that copies of the Nikolaev shipyard imagery had been disseminated to several hundred personnel across various agencies and military commands during the months before the Janes publication. The Naval Investigative Service coordinated with the Defense Intelligence Agency, the NSA, and the CIA to compile a comprehensive list of personnel who had accessed the specific satellite imagery in the weeks before the Janes publication. Computer access logs from intelligence community databases, vault sign-out sheets from secure document repositories, and distribution records from intelligence reports were systematically reviewed. This process, which took approximately 2 weeks of intensive effort by a team of investigators and security specialists, identified dozens of individuals who had documented access to the photographs during the relevant time period from June through July 1984. Simultaneously, investigators began examining who among naval intelligence personnel had connections to defense publications, particularly to Jane's Defense Weekly. This was considered a potentially smaller pool, as most intelligence analysts did not have outside professional activities that would bring them into regular contact with journalists or defense publications. Personnel security files were reviewed to identify individuals who had reported outside writing activities or who had requested permission to engage in freelance journalism. Cross-referencing the list of personnel with access to the photographs against the list of personnel with journalism connections quickly identified Samuel Morrison as a person of significant interest. Morrison's published articles in Jane's Defense Weekly were a matter of public record and were documented in his personnel security file. His employment file indicated that he had requested and received permission to engage in outside writing activities, though that permission had been granted based on his explicit assurance in writing that he would not use classified information in his published work, and that he would submit articles for pre-publication security review when they touched on topics related to his official duties. A review of his published articles suggested that he had not been submitting material for security review, which itself constituted a violation of the terms under which his outside writing had been approved. The Naval Investigative Service contacted Jane's Defense Weekly editors in London through official diplomatic and law enforcement channels and requested information about the source of the satellite photographs. The editors declined to identify their source, citing journalistic privilege, source protection, and the tradition of editorial independence. British authorities, while sympathetic to U.S. concerns about classified information, confirmed that British law did not compel Janes to reveal confidential sources and that no legal mechanism existed to force disclosure. However, investigators had other methods available that did not depend on Jane's cooperation. A review of Morrison's financial records, obtained through a federal grand jury subpoena, showed multiple check payments from Jane's Defense Weekly Limited throughout 1983 and 1984. Most significantly, the records showed a check payment deposited to Morrison's account in mid to late August 1984, shortly after the photographs had been published. The check was for $350. When investigators contacted Janes through official channels and asked about this specific payment, the editors confirmed that it was payment for an article Morrison had submitted along with the photographs, the very article that had been published alongside the satellite imagery. On August 29, 1984, Naval Investigative Service agents executed a search warrant at Morrison's apartment in Crofton, Maryland. The warrant had been authorized by a federal magistrate based on an affidavit detailing the evidence connecting Morrison to the Janes leak. Morrison was not home at the time of the search. He was at work at the Naval Intelligence Support Center, apparently maintaining his normal routine and unaware that he was under investigation. Agents conducting the search found extensive evidence of security violations and unauthorized disclosure, according to the search warrant inventory filed with the court. Our agents found in Morrison's apartment photographic copies of the satellite photographs that had been published in Jane's, correspondence with Jane's Defense Weekly editors discussing article submissions and payment, notes and drafts of articles based on classified information, other classified documents that Morrison had apparently removed from the Naval Intelligence Support Center over a period of months or years, including intelligence reports on Soviet submarine capabilities, analyses of Soviet naval exercises in the Pacific and Atlantic, and technical assessments of Soviet weapons systems. The documents were marked with classification levels ranging from confidential to secret, and several bore compartmented control markings indicating special access programs. Morrison was arrested that afternoon as he arrived home from work. According to the arrest report filed by Special Agent Hartman, Morrison appeared shocked when confronted by agents waiting at his apartment. When informed that he was under arrest for espionage and theft of government property, Morrison initially denied any wrongdoing and stated that there must be some mistake. When informed that classified documents had been found in his apartment during the search, Morrison stated that he had been working on a book about Soviet naval power and that he had inadvertently brought some work materials home. When confronted specifically about the satellite photographs published in Jane's, Morrison stated he had no knowledge of how Janes had obtained them. When presented with the financial records showing the $350 payment from Janes deposited to his account shortly after the photographs were published, Morrison stated he wanted to speak to an attorney and declined to answer further questions. Morrison was transported to the federal courthouse in Baltimore and appeared before a magistrate for an initial appearance and bail hearing. He was charged with 2 counts of espionage under 18 U.S.C. Section 793D and E, which prohibit unauthorized possession and transmission of national defense information, and with 1 count of theft of government property under 18 U.S.C. Section 641, referring to the physical removal of the classified photographs and documents from the Naval Intelligence Support Center. The charges carried severe potential penalties. Each count of espionage carried a maximum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. The theft charge carried a maximum of 10 years as well. If convicted on all counts and sentenced to consecutive terms, Morrison faced the possibility of 30 years in federal prison. At 41 years old, a 30-year sentence would effectively mean spending the remainder of his productive life incarcerated. The government opposed bail, arguing that Morrison posed a flight risk and a continuing security threat. The magistrate, however, ordered Morrison released on $100,000 bond secured by property, with conditions including surrender of his passport, prohibition on contact with foreign nationals except in the presence of his attorney, prohibition on accessing classified information, and termination of his employment at the Naval Intelligence Support Center. His security clearance was immediately revoked, and he was escorted from the Naval Intelligence Support Center that same day, never to return. Morrison returned to his apartment to find that his life had fundamentally changed. Within days, investigative reporters had identified him as the subject of the espionage charges, and his name and photograph appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Reporters began calling his apartment and approaching his neighbors for comment. His ex-wife contacted him, expressing concern about the impact on their children. Friends and former colleagues distanced themselves, uncertain whether association with someone charged with espionage might affect their own security clearances. The case immediately attracted significant attention from both the intelligence community and from press freedom advocates, though for very different reasons. For the intelligence community, Morrison's prosecution was seen as essential to maintaining the integrity of classification systems and deterring future leaks. Intelligence officials argued that if employees could leak classified information to publications with impunity, the entire classification system would become meaningless. For press freedom advocates and some journalists, the case raised profound concerns about the government's ability to control information and about what they saw as the criminalization of providing information to the press, an activity they argued should be protected under the First Amendment. Morrison retained attorney Michael Liebig, a defense lawyer with experience in national security cases. Liebig recognized that the case presented significant legal and public relations challenges. The evidence against Morrison was strong. The photographs had been found in his apartment, the financial records showed payment from Jane's, and Morrison's access to the classified imagery was documented. A conventional defense based on denying the facts would likely fail. Instead, Liebig developed a defense strategy based on arguing that Morrison had not committed espionage because he had not transmitted information to a foreign government, but rather to a publication that served the public interest, and that prosecuting someone for leaking to the press rather than to a hostile intelligence service set a dangerous precedent that could criminalize investigative journalism and whistleblowing. The government's position, articulated by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Schatzow, was that the law made no distinction between transmitting classified information to a foreign government and transmitting it to a publication. The Espionage Act's language prohibited unauthorized disclosure of national defense information to anyone not authorized to receive it, regardless of that person's intentions, affiliations, or relationship to the United States. The government argued that allowing leakers to claim First Amendment protection would effectively nullify the classification system, undermine national security, and establish that government employees could unilaterally decide what classified information should be made public. The trial began on October 1, 1985, in the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland in Baltimore, with Judge Joseph Howard Young presiding. Judge Young, appointed to the federal bench in 1979, had a reputation as a careful jurist who took national security cases seriously, but who also respected constitutional principles and due process. The prosecution presented what was essentially a straightforward documentary case based on physical evidence and financial records. Government witnesses included classification experts who testified about why the satellite photographs were properly classified and what damage their disclosure caused to national security. Navy Captain Thomas Brooks, who served as the classification authority for naval intelligence materials, testified that the photographs were classified secret/talent keyhole because they revealed satellite reconnaissance capabilities, targeting priorities, and analysis methods. He explained that publication of the photographs allowed adversaries to understand what the United States could observe from space, which could inform countermeasures such as camouflage, concealment, or operational security changes. Captain Brooks concluded his testimony by stating that the publication represented, in his professional judgment, a serious compromise of national technical means of verification, a diplomatic term for satellite reconnaissance systems protected under arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. Dr. Raymond Tate, a photo interpretation expert from the CIA, testified about the technical characteristics of the photographs that identified them as KH-11 satellite imagery. He explained that the resolution, the angle of view, the lack of atmospheric distortion, and other technical factors created a signature that knowledgeable analysts could recognize. He testified that publication of the photographs in Jane's effectively announced to the world that the United States possessed satellite reconnaissance capabilities of extraordinary resolution and that these capabilities were being used to monitor Soviet naval construction. Security personnel from the Naval Intelligence Support Center testified about access procedures and about Morrison's documented access to the photographs. Computer logs showed that Morrison had accessed the imagery database containing the Nikolaev shipyard photographs on July 23, 1984, one day before he removed the physical prints from the secure vault. Vault access logs showed his signature acknowledging removal of materials on July 24, though he had not returned them as required by security procedures. Financial experts testified about the payment from Jane's Defense Weekly to Morrison. Bank records showed the deposit in mid to late August 1984. Investigators had obtained copies of the check from Morrison's bank, and the check clearly identified the payer as Jane's Defense Weekly Limited and included a notation indicating it was payment for article and photographs. This directly contradicted Morrison's initial denial of any knowledge of how Jane's had obtained the satellite imagery. The defense attempted to argue that Morrison had believed he was serving the public interest by revealing information about Soviet military capabilities that the American public should be aware of in order to make informed judgments about defense policy and military spending. Liebig called Morrison to testify in his own defense. On the stand, Morrison acknowledged that he had taken the photographs and sent them to Jane's, but he characterized his actions as whistleblowing and as contributing to public discourse rather than as espionage. Morrison testified that he believed the photographs were being unnecessarily classified to prevent public scrutiny rather than to protect legitimate national security interests. He testified that the Soviet carrier program was a matter of public interest and that American citizens had a right to know about Soviet military developments that might affect their security and that might justify defense spending. He testified that he had not intended to harm the United States and that he had believed publication of the photographs would actually benefit the country by informing public debate. Under cross-examination by Schatzow, however, Morrison's testimony became problematic for his defense. Schatzow established through systematic questioning that Morrison had received multiple payments from Jane's for articles that included information derived from classified sources. Financial records showed at least 8 separate payments totaling approximately $2,800 over 2 years. Schatzow established that Morrison had removed numerous classified documents from the Naval Intelligence Support Center beyond just the satellite photographs, including documents that had no apparent whistleblowing purpose and that related to routine intelligence assessments rather than to matters of public controversy. Schatzow established through Morrison's own testimony that Morrison had signed numerous non-disclosure agreements acknowledging his obligation to protect classified information and acknowledging that unauthorized disclosure could result in criminal prosecution. Morrison had to admit on the stand that he had read these agreements, understood them, and signed them voluntarily as a condition of maintaining his security clearance. Schatzow established that Morrison had never attempted to use official channels to argue that the photographs should be declassified before he leaked them to Janes. There was no evidence that Morrison had raised concerns about improper classification through his chain of command with security officials or with any oversight body. Most damagingly, Schatzow established that at the time of the leak, Morrison had been experiencing financial difficulties due to child support obligations and had been actively seeking additional income from writing. Bank records showed that Morrison's checking account had been overdrawn twice in the 6 months before the leak, and that he had taken out a personal loan to cover expenses. Correspondence between Morrison and Jane's editors, seized during the apartment search, showed that Morrison had been actively pitching article ideas and had expressed interest in becoming a regular paid contributor. The picture that emerged from the cross-examination was not of a principled whistleblower, but of someone whose ideological rationalizations were intertwined with financial motivations and professional ambitions. The prosecution also called rebuttal witnesses who addressed Morrison's claim that publication served the public interest. Defense Department officials testified that the information about the Soviet carrier program that was legitimately available to the public through official statements and unclassified intelligence assessments already provided sufficient basis for informed debate about defense policy. They argued that the satellite photographs added nothing to legitimate public discourse that was not already available through proper channels, but did add substantial information to Soviet understanding of U.S. reconnaissance capabilities. Judge Young's instructions to the jury were crucial to the outcome and would later become the focus of appellate review. He instructed the jury that under the Espionage Act, the government did not need to prove that Morrison had intended to harm the United States or to benefit a foreign power. The government needed only to prove that Morrison had knowingly and willfully possessed national defense information that he was not authorized to possess, and that he had knowingly and willfully transmitted that information to someone not authorized to receive it. The judge instructed the jury that Morrison's beliefs about whether the information should have been classified or whether disclosure served the public interest were not relevant to determining guilt under the statute. The only questions were whether the information was in fact classified, whether Morrison knew it was classified, and whether he intentionally transmitted it to Janes. The jury deliberated for approximately 9 hours over 2 days. According to later interviews with jurors conducted by journalists, the deliberations focused primarily on whether Morrison's actions fit within the technical requirements of the statute rather than on broader questions about whistleblowing or public interest. Several jurors later stated that they found Morrison somewhat sympathetic and that they were uncomfortable with the idea that leaking to the press could be treated as espionage, but that they ultimately concluded that the evidence clearly showed he had violated the law as the judge had explained it. On October 17, 1985, the jury returned a verdict finding Morrison guilty on all counts, 2 counts of espionage under 18 U.S.C. Section 793, D and E, and 1 count of theft of government property under 18 U.S.C. Section 641. As the verdict was read, Morrison sat motionless at the defense table. Liebig immediately requested that Morrison remain free on bond pending sentencing, and Judge Young granted the request over government objection. Apparently concluding that Morrison had complied with all bail conditions during the trial and did not pose a flight risk. Morrison's conviction marked the first time in U.S. history that someone had been convicted under the Espionage Act for leaking classified information to the press rather than to a foreign government or hostile intelligence service. Every previous espionage prosecution under the statute had involved individuals who had transmitted information to the Soviet Union, China, or other adversaries, traditional spies engaged in espionage for a foreign power. Morrison's case established the legal precedent that the Espionage Act could be used to prosecute leakers who provided classified information to journalists or publications, a precedent that would have significant implications for decades to come. Sentencing was scheduled for December 4, 1985. In the weeks before sentencing, both sides submitted extensive materials to the court. Morrison's defense team submitted character references and letters from supporters arguing for leniency. Priscilla Barton Morrison, Samuel Eliot Morrison's widow, and Samuel Loring, Morrison's step-grandmother, submitted a letter describing her step-grandson's lifelong admiration for his grandfather and his sincere interest in naval history and in serving his country. Former colleagues from the Naval Intelligence Support Center submitted letters describing Morrison as knowledgeable, dedicated to his analytical work, and genuinely interested in understanding Soviet naval capabilities. Journalism organizations, including the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, submitted amicus briefs warning that harsh sentencing could have a chilling effect on investigative reporting about national security matters and could discourage government employees from coming forward with information about waste, fraud, or abuse. The government submitted its own sentencing memorandum arguing that Morrison's actions had caused serious damage to national security, had compromised critical intelligence collection methods, and had betrayed the trust placed in him by the United States government. Classified damage assessments prepared by naval intelligence officials and submitted to the court under seal detailed how the satellite photographs publication had allowed the Soviet Union to understand U.S. surveillance capabilities and had prompted documented changes in Soviet security procedures at the Nikolaev shipyard, including construction of camouflage structures and alteration of work schedules to reduce observable activity during known satellite passes. On December 4, 1985, Judge Young sentenced Samuel Loring Morison to 2 years in federal prison on each of the 2 espionage counts, to run concurrently, and to 2 years on the theft count, also concurrent. The total sentence was 2 years of incarceration. This was significantly less than the maximum 30 years he could have received, but it was also a substantial prison sentence that reflected the seriousness with which the court viewed his offenses. Judge Young stated in his sentencing remarks that Morrison had violated a position of trust that went to the very heart of the national security system, that his actions had damaged national security by compromising intelligence sources and methods, and that deterrence of future leaks required a sentence that included incarceration. However, Judge Young also acknowledged that Morrison had no prior criminal record, that he had cooperated to a degree with investigators after his arrest, that his motivations appeared to be a complex mixture of idealism and self-interest rather than hostility to the United States, and that a lengthy sentence would serve no additional deterrent purpose beyond demonstrating that such violations would result in imprisonment. Morrison was ordered to report to the federal prison camp Allenwood in Montgomery, Pennsylvania, on January 15, 1986. His attorneys filed notice of appeal of both the conviction and the sentence, arguing that the conviction under the Espionage Act for leaking to the press was unconstitutional under the First Amendment, and that the sentence, while relatively modest, was nonetheless excessive given the circumstances. The appeal would be heard by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, which has jurisdiction over federal appeals from Maryland. Samuel Morrison reported to prison as ordered in January 1986. The federal prison camp Allenwood was a minimum security facility located in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, approximately 150 miles northwest of Washington, D.C. The facility, which housed primarily white-collar offenders and nonviolent federal prisoners, consisted of dormitory-style housing rather than cells, and inmates had considerably more freedom of movement than at higher security institutions. Prison records indicate that Morrison was assigned to work in the prison library, where his educational background and research skills made him a suitable candidate for cataloging materials and assisting other inmates with legal research for their own cases. According to later interviews with former inmates who served time with Morrison at Allenwood, he adapted to incarceration with considerable difficulty. He was 42 years old when he entered prison, educated and accustomed to intellectual work, and psychologically unprepared for the loss of autonomy and dignity that imprisonment entails even in minimum security facilities. He maintained his belief that he had been prosecuted for journalism rather than for espionage, and he discussed his case with other inmates, some of whom were sympathetic and others who were not. The federal prison system housed individuals convicted of a wide range of offenses, and Allenwood included some inmates who had themselves been convicted of espionage for hostile powers and who viewed Morrison's claims of innocence and his characterization of his actions as whistleblowing with open skepticism. While Morrison endured the daily realities of minimum security incarceration, his legal team prepared appellate briefs arguing that his conviction represented a dangerous expansion of espionage law. The appeal focused on two primary arguments: that the Espionage Act had been intended by Congress to prosecute spies working for foreign governments, not individuals who leaked information to the press, and that applying the statute to press leaks violated the First Amendment by criminalizing activity that many reasonable people believed was protected speech. The government's response brief argued that the statute's plain language prohibited unauthorized disclosure to anyone not authorized to receive classified information, and that the First Amendment did not create a special exemption for leakers or for publications that received stolen classified material. In October 1988, more than 2.5 years after his conviction, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals issued its ruling in United States v. Morrison. In a 2-to-1 decision, the appeals court upheld Morrison's conviction. The majority opinion, written by Judge K. Hall, held that the Espionage Act's language was clear and unambiguous in prohibiting unauthorized disclosure of national defense information to anyone not authorized to receive it, regardless of whether that recipient was a foreign government, a hostile intelligence service, or a news organization. The court rejected the First Amendment arguments, stating that neither Morrison as a government employee with a security clearance nor Jane's Defense Weekly as a publication had a constitutional right to receive or publish properly classified information that had been stolen from the government. The dissenting opinion, written by Judge Donald Russell, argued that the Espionage Act had been enacted in 1917 during World War I and had been intended by Congress to prosecute spies working for foreign governments and saboteurs, not individuals who leaked information to the press. Judge Russell argued that applying the statute to press leaks raised serious First Amendment concerns because it effectively criminalized a category of activity, providing information to journalists, that many people reasonably believed was protected speech. He argued that if Congress wanted to criminalize leaking to the press, it should enact a specific statute clearly addressing that activity rather than relying on an expansive interpretation of a statute enacted for different purposes. However, this dissent did not represent the court's ruling, and Morrison's conviction stood. Morrison's legal team, now joined by attorneys from press freedom organizations who were concerned about the precedent, petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to review the case. The petition argued that the case raised important constitutional questions about the intersection of the Espionage Act, the First Amendment, and freedom of the press. The petition was supported by amicus briefs from major news organizations including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and various journalism advocacy groups. In March 1989, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case without comment, letting the Fourth Circuit's ruling stand. This meant that Morrison's conviction was final, and that the legal precedent established by his case, that the Espionage Act could be used to prosecute leakers who provided information to the press, remained valid law. Samuel Morrison was released from the federal prison camp Allenwood in late 1988 after serving approximately 22 months of his 2-year sentence, with credit for good behavior under federal sentencing guidelines then in effect. He was 45 years old with a felony conviction for espionage, a permanently revoked security clearance, and severely limited employment prospects. After his release, Morrison faced the profound challenge of rebuilding a life that had been fundamentally disrupted. His conviction made it impossible for him to work in intelligence, defense contracting, or in any position requiring a security clearance, eliminating virtually all of the employment opportunities for which his education and experience had prepared him. He moved to the Baltimore area, where he worked a series of jobs that made use of his educational background without requiring security clearances. According to public records and later interviews, he worked at various times as a researcher for historical projects, a technical writer for commercial publications, and a consultant on naval history for documentary filmmakers and authors. None of these positions provided the income or professional satisfaction he had once aspired to, and Morrison struggled financially for years. He continued to maintain that his conviction had been unjust, and that he had been prosecuted for journalism rather than for espionage. He gave occasional interviews to journalists and researchers interested in the intersection of national security and press freedom, consistently emphasizing that he had not been working for a foreign government, had not received substantial payment for the leaked information, and had believed he was contributing to public understanding of important defense matters. He described himself as having been made an example of by a government that valued secrecy over democratic accountability, though this characterization was not widely accepted outside of certain press freedom advocacy circles. On January 20, 2001, in one of his final acts before leaving office, President Bill Clinton pardoned Morrison after more than a decade of advocacy by Morrison, his attorneys, and press freedom organizations. The pardon restored Morrison's civil rights, including the right to vote and to serve on juries, but it did not overturn his conviction or expunge it from his criminal record. In his statement explaining the pardon, Clinton noted that Morrison had already served his sentence, that he had been substantially punished for his actions, and that the pardon would serve the interests of justice given the unique circumstances of the case. Specifically, that Morrison had been the first person prosecuted under the Espionage Act for leaking to the press rather than to a hostile foreign power. The pardon was controversial and generated significant debate. Press freedom advocates and civil liberties organizations viewed it as a recognition that Morrison's prosecution had been excessive and that leaking to the press should not be equated with traditional espionage. Intelligence community officials and many members of Congress viewed the pardon as sending a dangerous signal that the government would not fully hold accountable those who leaked classified information, potentially encouraging future leaks by suggesting that political pressure could eventually lead to clemency. For Morrison himself, the pardon provided a degree of vindication and relief, but it did not substantially change his material circumstances or undo the damage to his reputation and career. He was 58 years old at the time of the pardon, and the conviction had already defined 15 years of his adult life. He continued to work in historical research and writing, producing articles for military history journals and contributing to naval history projects, but he never achieved the recognition or professional success that he had aspired to when he first began his relationship with Jane's Defense Weekly in 1982. Samuel Loring Morison died on September 15, 2018, at the age of 75, in a nursing facility in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. His obituary in the Baltimore Sun identified him as a naval intelligence analyst and historian who had been convicted under the Espionage Act for leaking classified satellite photographs to a British defense publication and who had later been pardoned by President Clinton. The obituary noted that he was survived by 2 adult children and several grandchildren, but it did not include details about his relationships with them or about the impact his conviction and imprisonment had on his family. According to people who knew the family, Morrison's children had been in their mid-teens when he was convicted and imprisoned. They had to navigate adolescence and young adulthood with a father who was incarcerated for espionage and who later struggled to rebuild his life and career. The relationship between Morrison and his children remained strained for years, with contact maintained but limited. The conviction had created a barrier of shame, confusion, and anger that was never fully overcome. His children had to explain to friends, romantic partners, and eventually employers why their father had a federal espionage conviction, and this created a burden they carried throughout their lives. In the years following Morrison's conviction, the precedent established by his case that the Espionage Act could be used to prosecute individuals who leaked classified information to the press was cited in subsequent leak investigations and prosecutions. The precedent was invoked during the Obama administration's aggressive prosecution of leakers, including cases against former CIA officer Jeffrey Sterling, former NSA contractor Thomas Drake, and former Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning. It was cited again during investigations into leaks during the Trump administration. The legal framework established by United States versus Morrison became a standard tool for investigating and sometimes prosecuting government employees who provided classified information to journalists. The case became part of the ongoing and unresolved tension between government secrecy and press freedom. National security officials view the precedent as an important tool for protecting classified information and maintaining the integrity of classification systems. Journalists and civil liberties advocates view it as a threat to investigative reporting and to the ability of the press to inform the public about government activities. Both perspectives reflect genuine concerns and legitimate interests that cannot be fully reconciled. The specific satellite photographs that Morrison leaked in 1984 became permanently part of the public record through their publication in Jane's Defense Weekly. They were subsequently reproduced in other defense publications, in books about Soviet naval power, and eventually posted on the Internet. The Soviet aircraft carrier shown under construction in the photographs, which was officially named Admiral Kuznetsov when commissioned in 1990, remained in service with the Russian Navy for decades. The carrier experienced numerous mechanical problems and spent extended periods in maintenance and repair, reflecting broader challenges in the Soviet and later Russian naval aviation programs. The carrier was deployed in combat operations, most notably launching aircraft in support of Russian military operations in Syria beginning in 2016. Whether Morrison's leak of the photographs actually damaged U.S. national security in any measurable way remains a subject of debate that cannot be definitively resolved. Classified damage assessments prepared by naval intelligence officials and reviewed by the court argued that the leak compromised intelligence sources and methods by revealing satellite capabilities and allowed the Soviet Union to implement countermeasures against satellite surveillance. However, critics of Morrison's prosecution have argued that the photographs revealed little that Soviet intelligence did not already know or could not reasonably infer about U.S. satellite capabilities, and that the real damage was more to the principle of classification security than to any specific operational capability. The truth likely lies somewhere between these positions. The leak caused some genuine damage, but not catastrophic damage, and it revealed capabilities that sophisticated adversaries already suspected but had not confirmed. The broader question raised by Morrison's case concerns the appropriate balance between government secrecy and public disclosure in a democratic society. The U.S. classification system designates millions of documents and images as classified each year, based on determinations by government officials that disclosure would damage national security. Critics argue that the system overclassifies information, hiding material that should be public in order to avoid embarrassment, shield policy decisions from scrutiny, or maintain bureaucratic control. Defenders of the system argue that the complexity of modern intelligence gathering and military operations requires extensive classification to protect sources, methods, capabilities, and operational plans. Both arguments have merit. Morrison's case sits at the uncomfortable intersection of these competing principles. By any objective measure, the satellite photographs he leaked were properly classified. As intelligence officials had testified during the trial, the images revealed reconnaissance capabilities, targeting priorities, and the detailed level of Soviet shipbuilding intelligence available to the U.S. government. The classification was not arbitrary or motivated by improper purposes, but reflected reasoned judgments about protecting intelligence capabilities. At the same time, the photographs revealed information that was of legitimate public interest, the development of Soviet naval capabilities that could affect U.S. security, and that Congress and the public had a legitimate interest in understanding as they made decisions about defense spending, force structure, and strategic policy. The existence of the Soviet carrier program was not a secret. The Soviet Union publicly acknowledged building carriers. What the photographs revealed was the specific state of construction, the size and characteristics of the vessel, and the timeline to operational deployment. Whether the public's interest in this information outweighed the security concerns about revealing intelligence capabilities is a question that reasonable people can answer differently. Morrison's motivations complicate any moral assessment of his actions. He was not a purely idealistic whistleblower acting solely to inform the public about matters of urgent importance. He was also seeking professional recognition, additional income, and validation from the defense journalism community. He enjoyed being valued by Jane's Defense Weekly as a knowledgeable source. He benefited financially, even if modestly, from providing exclusive information. He rationalized his actions as serving the public interest, but those rationalizations conveniently aligned with his own interests. Human motivations are rarely pure, and Morrison's case illustrates the difficulty of separating principled disclosure from self-interested leaking. The consequences for Morrison were severe and lasting. He served nearly 2 years in federal prison. His career in intelligence ended permanently. His professional reputation was damaged in ways that affected his employment prospects for the rest of his working life. His financial security was undermined. His relationship with his children was strained and never fully recovered. But he survived. He was eventually pardoned, and he lived to age 75. The damage to him was real and permanent, but it was not total destruction. He built a life after prison, albeit a diminished one compared to what he might have achieved. The broader impact of his case on journalism and government secrecy has been significant and continues to unfold. The legal precedent that someone can be prosecuted under the Espionage Act for leaking to the press has been used by subsequent administrations to investigate and sometimes prosecute government officials who leak classified information to journalists. This has created a chilling effect on some potential whistleblowers and has made some journalists more cautious about soliciting or publishing classified information. At the same time, leaks of classified information continue to occur with regularity. Major leak cases in the decades since Morrison, including the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam era, the WikiLeaks disclosures, the Edward Snowden revelations, demonstrate that neither the Morrison precedent nor aggressive prosecution strategies have prevented determined individuals from disclosing classified information they believe should be public. The tension between the government's need to protect classified information and the public's interest in knowing what their government is doing remains fundamentally unresolved. Morrison's case did not settle this tension. It simply established one legal framework within which the tension continues to play out through investigations, prosecutions, debates, and ongoing conflicts between the national security establishment and investigative journalists. For the naval intelligence community, Morrison's case prompted comprehensive reviews of security procedures and heightened awareness of insider threats. The recognition that a longtime analyst with an exemplary security record could systematically remove classified material and leak it to a publication led to enhanced monitoring of access to sensitive information, more rigorous background checks, and periodic reinvestigations of personnel with clearances. Increased emphasis on security culture and the obligations of personnel with access to classified information, and development of more sophisticated insider threat detection programs that monitor anomalous behavior patterns. For Jane's Defense Weekly, the publication of the satellite photographs represented both a journalistic achievement and a cautionary episode. The photographs had been a significant scoop that enhanced the publication's reputation for exclusive coverage of military developments, but the subsequent revelation that the photographs had been illegally leaked by a U.S. government employee and the criminal prosecution of their source created ethical questions about the publication's role and responsibilities. Jane's editors had not actively solicited the classified photographs and had no legal obligation under British law to refuse them once offered, but they had accepted them and published them, knowing or strongly suspecting they might be classified U.S. intelligence material. The incident prompted internal discussions at Jane's and at other defense publications about editorial policies regarding classified information and about the responsibilities of publications that receive such material. The question of what journalists should do when offered classified information that is clearly newsworthy and of public interest, but also clearly stolen from the government, remains ethically and legally complex. Different news organizations have different internal policies, and individual journalists and editors make case-by-case judgments based on their assessment of the public interest value of the information, the potential harm from disclosure, the source's motivations, and their legal and ethical obligations. There is no consensus answer, and different cases are resolved differently depending on the specific circumstances. Morrison's case also raises fundamental questions about the role of individual judgment versus systemic authority in the classification system. Morrison believed that the satellite photographs should not have been classified, or at least that the public interest in the information outweighed the security concerns. He substituted his personal judgment for that of the officials who had classified the photographs and the institutional processes that maintained their classification. This substitution of individual judgment for systemic authority is inherent in all whistleblowing and unauthorized disclosure, and it creates a fundamental tension that democratic societies have never fully resolved. If individuals are permitted to override classification decisions based on their personal assessment of what should be public, then the classification system becomes meaningless because every person with access to classified information becomes a potential arbiter of what should be protected and what should be disclosed. But if individuals are never permitted to question or override classification decisions, then the system can be used to hide wrongdoing, incompetence, waste, abuse, or politically inconvenient information, and there is no mechanism for correcting improper classification except through the same officials who imposed it. Morrison's defenders argue that democratic systems require individuals who are willing to challenge classification decisions when those decisions serve bureaucratic interests, political convenience, or improper purposes rather than genuine security needs. They point to cases where leaked classified information revealed government wrongdoing or deception and argue that those disclosures served the public interest despite violating classification rules. Morrison's critics argue that the classification system cannot function if thousands of individual employees can unilaterally decide what should and should not be protected, and that proper channels exist for challenging classification decisions through official processes, inspectors general, congressional oversight, and declassification reviews. Both arguments have merit, and the tension between them reflects a genuine dilemma about how democratic societies should handle information that the government deems secret. This dilemma cannot be fully resolved through legal rules or policy guidelines because it involves competing values: security versus transparency, institutional authority versus individual conscience, systemic processes versus exceptional circumstances that cannot be perfectly balanced. The damage to Morrison's family from his conviction and imprisonment, while less visible than the policy debates and legal precedents, was real and lasting. His children were teenagers when he was convicted and incarcerated. They had to explain to friends, classmates, teachers, and eventually romantic partners and employers that their father was in federal prison for espionage. They had to process the shame, confusion, and anger that came from having a parent convicted of betraying his country, even as their father insisted he had been prosecuted for journalism. They had to navigate the social stigma and the psychological burden that his conviction created. Morrison's ex-wife faced her own challenges. She had to explain to their children what their father had done and why he was in prison, despite having limited understanding herself of the technical and legal complexities of the case. She had to manage the financial impact of losing child support payments while Morrison was incarcerated and of his dramatically reduced earning capacity after his release. She had to deal with the social consequences of being associated, however distantly, with an espionage case. The conviction affected her life and her children's lives in ways that received virtually no attention compared to the policy debates and constitutional questions the case generated. The moral complexity of Morrison's case becomes clearer when considering it from multiple perspectives simultaneously. From the perspective of naval intelligence officials who had worked to protect classified information and who took seriously their obligations to safeguard national security, Morrison was a betrayer who violated his oath, his professional obligations, and his solemn commitment to protect secrets for personal gain and recognition. From the perspective of press freedom advocates who believed in the crucial role of investigative journalism in holding government accountable, Morrison was prosecuted for doing what journalists and their sources do regularly, revealing information the public has a right to know about government activities and capabilities. From the perspective of Morrison's children, their father made choices that resulted in his imprisonment and that created shame and difficulty for them throughout their formative years and beyond. From Morrison's own perspective, he was serving what he believed to be a higher purpose by revealing information about Soviet military capabilities that informed public debate, but he was prosecuted by a government that valued institutional secrecy over democratic accountability. All of these perspectives contain elements of truth. Morrison did violate his oath and professional obligations. He did reveal information that was arguably of public interest. He did cause harm to his family through his choices. He did believe, at least in part, that he was serving a legitimate purpose. The difficulty is that these truths do not align neatly into a simple moral judgment that resolves the case into a story of heroism or villainy. The case remains morally ambiguous, and any honest assessment must acknowledge the legitimacy of competing perspectives. The legal system's response to Morrison, conviction under the Espionage Act, followed by a 2-year prison sentence, followed eventually by a presidential pardon, reflected this moral complexity. The conviction and sentence affirmed that leaking classified information is a serious crime with real consequences and that government employees cannot unilaterally decide what secrets to protect and what to disclose. The relatively modest sentence of 2 years, substantially below the maximum possible, acknowledged that Morrison's case was different from traditional espionage for a hostile power, and that his motivations, while not excusing his actions, distinguished him from spies motivated purely by money or ideology. The pardon, granted after Morrison had served his sentence and lived for more than a decade with the consequences of his conviction, acknowledged that the circumstances were unusual and that justice did not require permanent stigmatization. Samuel Loring Morison spent more than 30 years dealing with the consequences of decisions he made in 1984 when he was 41 years old and feeling frustrated with his career, his financial situation, and his failure to achieve the recognition he believed he deserved. He removed classified satellite photographs from the Naval Intelligence Support Center and mailed them to a British defense publication along with an article analyzing their significance. That action resulted in his conviction for espionage, his imprisonment for nearly 2 years, the permanent end of his career in intelligence, lasting damage to his reputation and relationships, decades of financial struggle and professional limitation, and a complicated legacy that remains disputed. He received a presidential pardon that restored his civil rights, but not his career or his reputation. He continued to work in naval history research and writing, but never achieved the recognition as a naval historian that he had aspired to from his youth. He maintained until his death that he had been punished for trying to inform the public about important matters of national security, though he also acknowledged in his later years the harm his actions had caused to his family and the complexity of his own motivations. Whether that belief in his essential righteousness was self-serving rationalization or genuine conviction is something perhaps even Morrison himself could never fully determine. Human motivations are rarely pure, and the boundary between serving the public interest and serving one's own interests is often blurred beyond recognition. Morrison wanted to contribute to public understanding of Soviet naval capabilities, but he also wanted recognition, income, and professional validation. He believed the photographs should be public, but he also benefited personally from making them public. He saw himself as serving democratic principles, but he also served his own ambitions. The photographs themselves, images of a Soviet aircraft carrier under construction in a Black Sea shipyard, captured by a U.S. reconnaissance satellite operating in the vacuum of space 200 miles above the Earth, leaked to a British defense publication by a frustrated naval intelligence analyst, remain available to anyone with an internet connection. The carrier they depicted was eventually commissioned and served in the Russian Navy for more than 2 decades. The intelligence capabilities they revealed were eventually superseded by newer and more sophisticated technologies. The classification system they belonged to continued generating millions of new classified documents each year. The tensions between secrecy and disclosure that Morrison's case highlighted remain as unresolved and as contentious now as they were in 1985. Samuel Morrison was 41 when he took the photographs from the vault at the Naval Intelligence Support Center. He was 45 when he was released from the federal prison camp Allenwood. He was 75 when he died, believing he had been prosecuted for journalism. And in between those moments, he lost the career he had hoped to build, the recognition he had aspired to earn, the financial security he had worked to establish, the relationship with his children that he had valued, and much of the life he had imagined for himself when he first walked out of that building in Suitland, Maryland, in July 1984, carrying classified satellite imagery concealed in his briefcase.